A note about questions. Please ask questions. We might not be able to get to them in the middle of the presentation, but we will reserve time afterwards to talk through everything. I'm sure people will have questions. So fire away. Just again, we can't give you legal advice, but we will do our best to help. Okay, so the first thing I want to talk about today is a key contract clause, and that'll obviously vary between industries, but you've probably heard the term force majeure. And a force majeure clause is a clause in the contract that says, basically, if something really terrible happens, the parties to the contract don't have to perform their obligations under the contract. This can be great if you're a buyer, because if your business stops, you don't want to be stuck purchasing goods that you don't need. But if you're a seller, it can really be detrimental. Obviously, your buyers stop buying or people stop performing, and you lose a lot of money. So I encourage each of you, if you have a contract, whether that's a lease, whether it's a master services agreement, a supply agreement, to go through and find your force majeure clause. Chances are, if it was signed before March of this year, it doesn't have a pandemic or a lockdown or a government shutdown included in the definition of force majeure. If you're a buyer, you're going to want to amend your contracts to include a lockdown or a pandemic as a definition of, or included in the definition of force majeure, because you want maximum flexibility to pause or unpause your contractual obligations during a disaster. If you're a seller, then you're going to want to get very specific in your force majeure clause. So it shouldn't just be, well, there's a lockdown. It should be something requiring specific effect to the buyer's business that would prevent them from performing. So let's say you are a restaurant and you want to make sure that your suppliers keep delivering during a pandemic. Well, the trucks can still run, and the supply chain hopefully will still be intact, even if other things are shut down, even if, say, the government buildings are shut down. So if you were a restaurant, you would want to draft into your contract with your suppliers that, notwithstanding a government shutdown, if the roads are still open, y'all are still delivering. A bit of an extreme example, but something to help from the physical world. That being said, everybody understands that if a lockdown goes on indefinitely, you need to have the ability to cancel a contract, because there's no point performing a contract if nobody's going to be buying or if the business is shut down. That's why, moving on to the next bullet point, I would advise startups to look at their contracts and draft in a clause that, let's say, if a force majeure event persists for over 1 or 2 months, then the party affected by that force majeure clause or that force majeure event can terminate the contract. It's important to not be locked into contracts, and I think nobody wants to perform a contract. It certainly gets very expensive to perform a contract when you're not getting the benefit of it. There's another possible way to soften the effects of a disaster if force majeure is occurring. And let's say you've got a bank or a lender or a VC that's counting on your business to produce cash flow, say to pay them back or to make a balloon payment on a loan. I have seen a couple of clients do what's called an equity cure for their contracts with whoever's financing them. And that basically says, well, if we can't perform due to force majeure, you, lender or financier, aren't going to call default on your loan or whatever and basically suck all the money out of our bank account. Instead, we as a startup will give you more equity in our company as opposed to sapping much needed cash out of the business. Now, these are kind of technical clauses to draft, and they do have tax implications. So definitely talk to an attorney before you go just trying to throw in a clause like this, but just know that it's an option if you're a startup. Another key clause in a contract during a disaster will deal with which party has to bear the increased costs of a lockdown or a disaster. So let's say you have a physical supply chain to run. Obviously, during a lockdown, shipping costs will increase. They'll probably be increased handling time, all sorts of costs go up. And if you don't specify who handles those costs, you could be left holding the bag. So my advice to you would be to itemize every single item of cost that can go into your contract, and then try to think of how it would increase or decrease during a disaster. And then allocate the risk of those costs to the party that's most able to bear those risks or control those risks. In that way, you're going to have a really specific contract that's going to protect you economically in case everything shuts down and prices go up. Now, maybe some prices will go down and you're free to handle that or not handle that in the contract. But this is really just for when prices go up. Commercial leases is the next topic. And this, if you have a physical lease, maybe you've got an office, maybe you've got a restaurant, chances are during a lockdown, you have had to negotiate with your landlord on rent deferment. I've seen a wide variety of different clauses during the lockdown, but I want to give you an idea of sort of what I've seen and what's market. The most common market term that I've seen for startups or small businesses negotiating with commercial landlords has been 2 months of rent deferment, and rent deferment, that rent being paid back over the next 6 to 12 months after the disaster or force majeure event stops. I've also seen startups actually re-up for additional terms instead of paying the rent up front. So let's say I need a 3-month rent deferment. The landlord will say, okay, but you've got to re-up or extend the term of your lease by another 1 or 2 years. I wouldn't necessarily recommend this because it locks you in for a lot longer. And so you're going to end up paying far more than you would if you simply possibly terminated or took a slow payback over extending the term of your lease. But that's sort of what I've seen in the market. So just remember that if you as a tenant are negotiating with your landlord, you are going to have a bit of flexibility, and they're going to have flexibility as well, because your landlord is probably negotiating with their bank and getting rent deferment during a lockdown as well. And lastly, I just wanted to hit on restaurant and retail leases. I've seen a couple of restaurants and retailers use their PPP loans or EIDL loans to pay rent instead of use that money for other purposes for which those loans were intended. That's a bad idea. Don't do that. You're basically betting that your business will come back just as strong as it was before the lockdown or force majeure event occurred. That's not a thing you want to bet on because we've seen business come back slower than people anticipated. Instead, what you could do is tie your rent payment to the amount of money that you're taking in as a business and sort of set the baseline as the average of the trailing 6 months before the force majeure event. And then say, well, our rent will be lowered based on what percentage of that baseline revenue we're taking in over the period. So you have a lot of levers to pull when you negotiate your contracts before a force majeure event, but after a force majeure event, after a lockdown, you have a lot less flexibility. So get on this now, talk to a lawyer. Okay, the next slide is about managing your employees during a disaster. And I'm sure we've all seen the OSHA and CDC guidance on how to come back to work safely. We've all seen, keep 6 feet away from the nearest employee. We've seen people stagger returning to the office 1 week on, 1 week off. This is mostly just to inform you, in case you didn't know, that there are an overlapping set of regulations from both federal and state agencies that will govern how you bring your employees back after something like this. So you're going to be checking a lot of websites. Obviously, you can call an attorney who can check these websites for you and sort of summarize the guidance, but there are a lot of things you need to be looking at. And it helps to have the contingency plan in place now versus trying to do it on the fly like a lot of our clients did. Another thing to keep in mind, and this sort of goes to the current climate, is social media policies. depending on how public facing your business is, some of your employees will probably want to speak out or voice an opinion, which is totally acceptable. But you as a business will have more control over how your employees present themselves or themselves as a representative of your business if you have social media policies in place from the get-go. And there are kind of two ways I've seen this done. The first is to simply require your employees, if they represent your business publicly, to have a disclaimer on their social media accounts saying, my opinions are my own. It does not represent what my employer thinks. It's not endorsed by my employer. And that's sort of the old school approach. The new school approach is what I call the NPR approach. If you go to NPR and you look at their employee policies, you will see something like 40 pages of very carefully written guidance on what it means to be a journalist and have your own opinions while you're representing NPR. So I would encourage you to go check it out because it's very nuanced. And you might think that having a long employee policy or social media policy would be a negative, but what it does is it gives NPR the ability to start a conversation with their employees about anything that employee could have said on their social media. It actually gives them more control because they have all this specific stuff out there on how they will judge what an employee says. So it creates a dialogue as opposed to the possibility of coming down and seeming heavy-handed with their employees when they voice their opinions. And finally, personal days for protests. So obviously in most major cities, there were a lot of protests over the last couple months, some of which are still ongoing. There isn't a federal or state law that I'm aware of that mandates that you give your employees days off to go participate in protests. However, you may want to give them that. And there's no problem with giving them days off for those protests. Just make sure that you enter their days off or you follow the protocol for them taking personal days to go out and protest the same way you would for any other unexplained or unexcused absence. Now, you can't fire an employee for engaging in lawful conduct outside of the workplace, which means if you happen to disagree with the protest that they went to, it's not lawful per se to fire them for that. So that's another trap that I think some overzealous employers have fallen into. So treat personal days like you would any other, except if you have a policy that excuses employees with certain notice requirements, of course, to go to protests. That's a very progressive and forward-thinking approach. And I think most of the folks on the call today would probably want to build something like that as a benefit into their employee handbook. And so I've got a list of other laws you might want to think about below in the compliance alphabet soup. These are 5 laws that could affect your employees coming back from a lockdown. For example, USERRA has to do with giving certain military personnel or first responders, like medical first responders, the right to get their job back after they've had to go perform their obligations. Family Medical and Leave Act. Let's say one of your employees has a family member that becomes sick from COVID and they have to take time off to go care for them. There are certain policies you have to follow when they are asking for that time off, and you also cannot discriminate against them in the workplace for taking that time off. Americans with Disabilities Act, we think of disabilities as, let's say, mobile or sight or what have you, but it can also be something caused by a disease. So if somebody has, let's say, a disability or a physical impairment after dealing with COVID, the ADA could apply to them. Workers Adjustment and Retraining Notification Act, that has to do with primarily if you're going to cut a workforce by more than a certain percentage, there are procedures you have to follow if you're a business of a certain size. So just be aware of that. And then maintaining employee benefits, make sure that you talk with your provider on your insurance provider or your benefits provider on what would happen during a lockdown. Let's say You could negotiate. I've seen clients negotiate lower premiums for employee benefits if they're not going to be in the office. Conversely, you should look at your coverage if you provide group medical to see what happens in the event of a lockdown, who pays for what, who pays for testing, who pays for sanitization, etc. Okay, executive misbehavior. This is a disaster of a different sort. It can happen at any time, and it doesn't have to do with COVID, thank goodness. But in every startup, there will be conflicting personalities, and I think that CEOs, by their very nature, can be headstrong. Not just CEOs, but CFOs, COOs, etc. But you have to remember when planning for executive misbehavior that the company is not the same thing as the executive. The company is a separate entity that needs to be protected. So to protect the company from misbehavior by executives, you can do a few things. And these are the basic ones that I've seen my clients have a bit of success with. First off, no brainer, you have to get directors and officers insurance. This covers you in case of negligence, fraud, etc., by the officers named on the policy. It's usually the C-suite executives. You need to have D&O insurance. I don't know of a single venture capitalist that will fund a business without D&O insurance, because usually, as a VC, when you're funding a startup, you're really funding the team first and the idea second. Second, if you have an executive that needs coaching, that has, say, obvious weaknesses or keeps stumbling over the same thing, possibly creating an HR issue, consider executive coaching. I've seen it go well and poorly depending on the coach, but at least when you start an executive down the path of executive coaching, it prevents them from being able to hide their behavior in plain sight. And it creates an expectation that they will try to improve. That said, if they keep doing the same thing, especially if there is a tinge of mistreating other employees or saying inappropriate things, I advise you to get a good HR person and conduct something that I call listen the first time trainings. As in, if an executive continues a pattern of behavior that's possibly harmful for the company, you should alert everyone that has to deal with them that that sort of behavior isn't acceptable, should be reported to HR. And on the back end of that, there are contractual clauses that you can put in an executive's agreement that deduct either equity or compensation or gives the company the right to terminate that executive for continued misbehavior of a certain kind. In this instance, I'm speaking more in terms of workplace harassment than any other kind of behavior. You can certainly terminate somebody for being bad at their job, but if people keep complaining about workplace harassment or inappropriate comments made by an executive, a lot of startups can feel powerless. But these contractual clauses, these trainings, these coaching sessions can help ease the executive out or let them know that there's a problem that they have to fix, instead of letting it become this cultural thing which festers and eventually trickles down and ruins morale. Another big concern can be if an executive monopolizes the bank account and uses it for personal funds or for personal use. This is a pretty easy solve, but you need to have participation in it. And that's having an accountant check in on a weekly basis with the sources and uses of funds and either send an email blast or have a call with everybody on the executive team or even the VP level, talking about where you are financially, what runway you have, what happened the last week in your finances. A controller can also do this internally. But even for my law firm, we have a weekly check-in with an accountant telling us how we did, what our major expenses have been, sort of truing up the books. And it's incredibly useful because we all are on the same page financially when it comes to knowing what's going on, who's spending what. And that's really helpful. And it can also stop an executive from misusing funds because nobody's watching. When it's public, when it's out there, there's a greater incentive to behave and to not misuse funds. And then finally, just as a practical matter, access backups. So let's say your CFO has a penchant for running off to Mexico and disappearing for 2 weeks at a time. Well, you need to be able to run your business when they're gone. So make sure that you have access backups for all executive logins. A good IT person should have this. If you have an outsourced IT person, you're going to want to set a procedure where they can enter an executive's account after a certain amount of time. So you need to be able to access those accounts if an executive disappears or, heaven forbid, something bad happens to them. And the last thing I want to talk about are IT best practices. These are a couple of things that I've picked up over the years, working with people far smarter than I am, so that you can function safely, remotely, and securely. So first, no-brainer probably, everybody's experienced this, configure your systems for remote work, whether that is getting a VPN or some other technical measure. This is a must-have. Don't just have all your files in Google Drive and have them open to anybody who has the link. Have your have this basic level of login and access controls paired with a VPN, so that no matter where your employees are working from, what they do is secure. Pen testing and bug bounty. Pen testing, for those of you who haven't gone through it, is called penetration testing. If you have, especially a software contract with a larger company, usually their MSA will demand some level of penetration testing for your systems. And you don't want to be hit with a $10,000 auditing expense when you have to sign an MSA with a larger company. It's just easier to get the penetration testing done beforehand or some sort of security audit, and then hand them the results saying, thank you very much, we can sign this contract now. I see this provision in pretty much every large MSA. Related to that is bug bounty. Bug bounty is if you have a public-facing product, you can put it out on the internet that if you find a flaw in our system, we will pay you some amount of money. I've seen it anywhere from $100 to $500, depending on the size of the bug or the severity of the bug. But that can really help. And frankly, I found some bug bounty programs to be better than professional pen testing. On top of that, I'd recommend regular security audits about once a year. A PIAA is a privacy impact assessment. So if you introduce a new product, especially one that collects sensitive information from data subjects, particularly in the EU and California, you're going to want to document what that product or process does, who it collects information from, what it does with that information, why that information is collected, so that you have a record of it. And it really helps us privacy lawyers help you with compliance down the road when you need it. And encryption at rest and in transit, again, fairly basic, but most large MSAs, especially in the SaaS space that I've seen, deal with encryption at rest and in transit. Costs a little bit more from Amazon Web Services. It costs a little bit more from Salesforce, but it's worth it. And finally, buy your IT person beer so they continue to talk to you and like you. That has probably been the most useful thing I have ever done. It's the best beer money I've spent, hands down. But talking about privacy, I'm going to segue now into Katie's section. So Katie, I believe you're going to talk about data privacy and compliance, and I will go ahead and mute myself.
Great. Will you help me with the slides? Documentation.
The NPR documentation, Katie just told me, Katie, I think you might still be on mute, but the NPR documentation is on NPR's website. I think if you just Google NPR social media policy, it should pop up. And it's, well, it reads kind of like an NPR session. It's very soft language, but it's like 40 pages long. It's really, really interesting. It kind of gives a glimpse into the culture of the organization. All right, with that, I'm going to mute. Katie, take it away.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Excellent. Thanks all. Okay, so I was talking about the California Consumer Privacy Act, the CCPA, that became effective January 1st of this year, January 1st of 2020, but the Attorney General was instructed not to start enforcing it until July 1st, 2020. So there's been kind of a mad dash. If you were very proactive, you would have had all of your CCPA compliance stuff in place by January 1st. If you were mostly proactive, you would have had it done by July 1st. And if you are now trying to keep from getting in trouble by the AG, you're desperately trying to get compliant now. And so the people that are subject to the California Consumer Privacy Act are businesses that process the personal information of California residents that have a gross revenue in excess of 25 million, or process the personal information of 50,000 or more consumers, households, or devices, or that derive 50% or more of their revenue from basically being a data broker, from sharing personal information. So even if you're a 25 mil or you're processing 50,000 people's worth of PII, even if not all of that money comes from California residents, or not all of that PII comes from California residents, if you meet that threshold and you process the information of one California resident, then you need to be compliant with the CCPA. So the obligations that this creates for businesses is that you have to provide a privacy policy. This hasn't been codified in the US until the CCPA, there's other California laws that kind of required this, but you do in fact have to have a privacy policy. You have to give consumers the right to access and delete their information. So that means that if a California resident asks what you know about them, you have to be able to tell them. And if they say they don't want you to store that information, you have to have a way to go in and pull it all from your systems and delete it. There's a couple of exceptions, but that's a bit granular. You also have to give people the option, if you are selling their information, you have to give them the option to request that you do not sell that. And the do not sell requirement also imposes the obligation for you to put a big, bold link on the front of your website where consumers can click on it and go in and make that request. And an interesting sort of in the last couple of weeks is that the industry that specifically the Silicon Valley technology industry has really kind of come to terms with the fact that the way that Google and Facebook and a couple of other sort of social media platforms like Pinterest and Twitter, the way that they perform their analytics and then sell that data back to businesses is in fact a sale. So if your company engages in Google Analytics with your website, that is probably a sale to which you both need to give people notice that you're doing and give consumers the option to opt out of. We can talk about that more at the end if you have questions. Another obligation is that consumers have to receive service treatment on equal terms. And so if someone opts not to provide you with their personal information, you can't then charge them more for the services that you provide unless you can prove that there's a direct link between their information and the service. And so that's kind of an opt-out that would be useful for data brokers. This is not a requirement, but it's a best practice, is that under the CCPA, you really need to be entering into data processing addendums with your vendors. And the reason why that's a best practice is because if you're sharing information with vendors, you need a mechanism in which you can tell them to access or delete information upon a consumer's request to you. And you can't really guarantee that without such an agreement. And finally, your compliance measures must also comply with the Americans with Disabilities Act. So this is really going to force businesses to get their websites available for ADA standards. So a question here is kind of gauging the business expense of compliance with the legal risk. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how California is enforcing this so that you can determine whether or not it's worth the cost of compliance for you. The CCPA provides the California Attorney General the right to fine non-compliant businesses from $2,500 to $7,500 per incident. And honestly, or per violation incident. And that's not a whole lot of money in the grand scheme of things. And you might look at that and think, it's much cheaper for me to just take the risk of paying a fine than to make my whole business compliant. Where the CCPA really gets risky for businesses is in the private right of action. And so it's designed in a manner that kind of encourages even class action lawsuits. And so if your business is breached as a result of a failure to implement the reasonable security required by the CCPA, an individual can sue you for $100 to $750 per consumer per incident. And so you kind of have to do the math on that. If you have the personal information of 10,000 individuals, multiply that times $100 per individual, then you're talking about real damages. And then, or if it's more like you have 1 million California consumers' information and they all sue you for $100 a piece on the low end and $750 a piece on the high end, then the math sort of works out more favorably towards compliance. So California is the most imminent U.S. data privacy law that's online right now. There's a couple of others that are under consideration. Specifically, Virginia has a law up for consideration. It was proposed in January. It's sort of like a conglomeration of the CCPA and the GDPR, Europe's privacy law. It's applicable to entities that conduct business in Virginia or target Virginia residents and control or process the data of 100,000 consumers or derive over 50% of gross revenue from the sale of personal data. And it has the same requirement for privacy policy, and it has the same requirement for a right to access and delete. But it's more like the GDPR in that consumers can also ask you to correct information if the information that you have about them is in error, and they can limit your processing within your list of activities. And so they can say you can process it in this way, but not in this way. Enforcement is enforced under the Virginia Consumer Protection Act law, so the same law that where people seek redress for like lemon laws or other like competitive business practices. And it has, if a consumer is successful, they can seek actual damages, what your breach actually cost them, or up to $500, whichever is greater. And then the Attorney General, the Virginia Attorney General, can also bring fines for up to $2,500 for willful violations. Other states that are considering similar laws, similar data privacy laws, are Florida, Illinois, Washington, Nebraska, New Jersey, and New Hampshire. So it's certainly, if your business is based in any of those states, you need to be paying attention to those laws and considering whether it makes sense to start building a compliant business model now. And if you target consumers in any of those states, you need to be thinking about that as well. So other data privacy laws that aren't necessarily state specific, that are industry specific that you might need to be thinking about are laws that target healthcare facilities. So we're all familiar with HIPAA. We've signed all of those release forms when we go to the doctor. So if you're in healthcare or if you're in workers' comp or anything like that, that's something that you probably need to be thinking about, is whether or not you're a HIPAA covered entity. But also if you are a service provider to a healthcare industry, so maybe you process like medical billing or you support a workers' comp claim company. Oftentimes those covered entities will ask you to sign a business associate agreement, a BAA, and that's just kind of a data processing agreement that is specific to the healthcare industry and HIPAA, in which you agree to protect the information that you're provided with the same standards that that the healthcare entity is. There's also data privacy requirements for insurance companies. There's data privacy requirements for people who process their own credit cards, so payment card industry standards. If you are an education institution or you deal with education records, you're likely subject to FERPA. And if you're an education institution that accepts federal funding for student loans, there's likely an agreement you have an SAIG agreement that likely has a requirement for a minimum security technology and for reporting in the case of a breach. Also, if you are in a business that targets children, you need to be aware of and compliant with COPPA. And then a few international pitfalls to think about is I mentioned the GDPR. It's not entirely accurate to say that it's the European version of the CCPA, but it's the EU and the European Economic Area comprehensive privacy law. You also need to be thinking about if you're either targeting consumers or you have employees in Europe. In addition to the GDPR, you need to consider the privacy laws of their individual member states. I see a lot of businesses transition between business in the US and in Australia. And Australia has really strict requirements for where you can process data. So if you have consumers or employees in Australia, that data is actually not allowed to leave the continent. And so you need to find ways to house and process that data there. And then also, I see a lot of business going on between the US and Canada has its own comprehensive privacy law. So think about that as well. Next slide. So that was kind of the pre-breach part of the presentation. And this is what happens when your technology fails, when your security processes fail. Some recent trends that I've seen in data breaches are ransomware. So the unauthorized actors will gain access through your network either by a brute force attack in which they are able to compromise your credentials just by stealing them from either the dark web or using software that generates passwords until they find one that fits. Or they use kind of like social engineering in which they phish your employees for their passwords, and then they use those passwords to gain access to the network. Once they're inside your network, oftentimes I see them just kind of hang out quietly and not draw attention to themselves for several weeks or months, even as long as a year or more. And during that time, they are just kind of getting a lay of your network landscape, and they are looking for passwords in which they can improve their access to your network. They're ultimately looking for credentials for system admin accounts so that they can go in and manipulate all of your antivirus and all of your security technology so that they can either turn it off or weaken it. And so that they can create connections between your network and their malicious network so that they can plug their malicious code in. Once they've achieved the level of access that they want, they then insert malicious code that encrypts your data, including oftentimes your backups, because they're looking for ways to sort of leverage your information in order to make you pay them. And so what they want to do is encrypt everything and lock it down so that you have to pay them for a decryption key so that you can get access again. That scenario that I just described was kind of very common until about 6 months ago. In the last 6 months, what we've began seeing is that in addition to encrypting your data, they also download it all to a local drive. And if you perhaps have viable backups, or you can keep your business in operation without having access to your data, they will then threaten to release all of the information that they stole from your system unless you pay them. And so they will publish it on their own sort of dark web blogs, or just dump it in public databases, or sell it to higher bidders who want whatever they stole from you, be it social security numbers, be it healthcare records, maybe it's proprietary business information, like things like your like inventions that you have working, or new products or whatever. And so I've also seen like rate sheets in which that businesses were very protective over, because they offered different rates to different clients. And so they didn't want their clients to know what the competing prices were. So even if you don't necessarily need the data to get yourself back up and running, you have to consider whether or not you need the data to keep yourself from suffering any kind of reputational harm or any embarrassment. So that's ransomware. I've also seen a lot of business email compromises where the malicious actors will get into your emails and they'll scope them out, either for social security numbers that they can sell on the dark web, or more often they're looking to do wire redirects. And so they're looking for instructions from you to your clients that are like payment instructions that contain wiring information. And the malicious actors, because they're present in your inbox, will they'll set rules so that you aren't able to see incoming mail, and they will then go in and pretend to be you, and they will change the wire information so that your clients then pay to different unauthorized banks. So in the case that you experience a breach, there's response regulations in all 50 states. And the state that controls is based on where the affected individual lives. So if you're a company that's based in Colorado, but you have employees in Kansas and Oklahoma, you're going to have to meet the state requirements for those employees that are based on Kansas and Oklahoma laws. All of these regulations require that you provide notice to the individuals that were impacted, so that you have to tell them what happened and kind of the who, what, when, where, and why of the incident. And notice must be provided ranging from 30 to 60 days based on the state from when you discover the breach. Some of those timelines give you time to secure your network and to accurately identify all of the impacted individuals, but some require that you report right away. For example, Vermont requires that you report within 14 days of learning of the breach, which is that's a pretty strict requirement. Oftentimes businesses haven't even gotten themselves unencrypted within 14 days. Some states require that you provide, if you have to provide notice of a breach to an individual, that you also provide notice of that breach to the Attorney General. And it's kind of a best practices that if people's social security numbers are involved in a breach, that you also, in addition to just notice, you also provide them credit monitoring. So the ways that you prevent a data breach, the first and the most important way is just to have good data security hygiene. Tom talked about some of those things earlier. You need to provide training to your employees on how to identify a phish and how to avoid it. So employees need training, especially employees that didn't grow up with as much contact with the internet as others. They need very specific training on how to identify a social engineering incident and how to report it and avoid it. Other things that are just kind of easy to take for granted but make a big difference are having a strong password. I see a lot of businesses use an 8-character password requirement. 8's just truly not enough. It can be broken by those brute force mechanisms that I described in a matter of minutes. 12 is better. That takes a couple of hours, and 16 is almost unbreakable. So at least with current technology. So a 16-character password that requires numbers and variable characters is where you want to be. You should also, if you have the option to turn on multi-factor authentication, you should. So then at least if the bad guys compromise your password, they probably won't also compromise your phone or your third device that keeps them from being able to get in. Let's see. You should also consider having an incident response plan. It's where your company practices going through this event and responding to it, so that in the case that it happens, and in my experience, it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when you're prepared and you're ready to go. You can consider outsourcing sensitive information, so like your payroll or your, what else? Like your, your client management system, like giving those to vendors that have really strong security is a good option, as long as you're confident that the vendors do have strong security. And then you should get insurance to cover this. Cyber insurance in the grand scheme of things is not that expensive. So work with your insurance broker to identify a good policy for you. Make sure that you have enough cash on hand to pay your retention, which is cyber insurance speak for your deductible. So make sure that your deductible is not so high that you can't afford it in the case of an incident. And you should know, kind of going into this, as far as like the question of why should I comply? Why should I notify individuals? Why should I report to the AG? The way that this is enforced is, again, through attorney generals issuing fines. It's also enforced through that CCPA private right of action. And there's some incentive for those state AGs to go after businesses that don't comply, because oftentimes those departments are self-funded. And so they pay their own salaries with cash that they generate from these complaints. Okay, I'm running out of time, so I'm going to go through the next couple of things pretty quickly. I talked a little bit about a sales pipeline resiliency. One solid way to develop sales resiliency is to control the inventory that you have out there. Don't just sell all of the inventory that you can to your partners, even though that might seem like a good idea, because in the case that they go broke, then you're stuck with this inventory that you have to get back from them. So manually control your inventory by only selling to them what they can sell. If they want a contractual right to inventory, have something that ramps up with sort of like quarterly milestones. And so if they perform well one quarter, then they get more inventory the next quarter, but make sure that you don't just dump it all on them. Also, make sure that your partner relationship documents, your partner contracts, contain buyback provisions, so that in the case that they're not able to sell all the inventory that you give them, that they're not allowed to just dump it on eBay or Amazon or some competitor that's going to disrupt your business. You can plan for their bankruptcy in that way. Diversify your delivery network. So with COVID, we saw the USPS getting kind of overwhelmed. A good takeaway from that is to look for other delivery systems. And then in the case that your sales kind of stagnate and you're not able to rely on that income, build ways to cut costs into your business plan. And so this means like whatever kind of hot new software as a service is out there that is promising that it's going to make your business a ton of money, that's great. But really vet those and make sure that they really are going to do what you think that they're going to do. Make sure that they're not going to overwhelm your employees and just be more work for them. And be sure to build in termination clauses into those agreements that are manageable, so that if the software either becomes too expensive or isn't justifiable, you can get out of paying for it. And then supply chain. I have much of the same advice as far as diversify your manufacturing network. So always consider alternatives to China. China has been kind of a tinderbox for manufacturing for a long time, and with this current political administration has gotten much worse. And so if there are other countries in which the U.S. has better relations than China where you can source your products, that's always a good choice. Consider getting the same products from multiple sources so that you've got other manufacturers to fall back on in the case that one goes bad. Monitor international news. So like the so that you can sort of be prepared for things like countries that are experiencing a pandemic, or countries that are experiencing hurricanes or tidal waves, or that have a lot of political upheaval. If you can afford it, build buffers into your supply chain so that you've got extra product on hand. I know that that's easier said than done, but you can also create buffers with maybe more local, maybe they're a bit more expensive manufacturers, but they're folks that you can call on in the case that you need some quick product. Also, make sure that you have deliberately and strategically categorized your products for import. And then all those contractual obligations that Tom talked about, call Tom and ask him about how to plan for that. And finally, develop a non-physical product so that you don't have to import anything at all. No big deal. Yeah.
All right, so right now, Katie's going to go through Q&A, and I think we're just going to answer whatever's come in.
Yeah, so I got a question about COPPA, the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act. It's a federal act, and if you are targeting children, or even if knowingly collecting the information about children that are 13 or under, there's a series of requirements that you need to comply with. It's a bit deep to get into right now, so just know that if that's you, you need to be thinking about COPPA.
I would also add that if you have a general audience website that conceivably could have child users, and you have any kind of knowledge that a child could be using your general audience product, if that is a game, if that's a social media site, as soon as you are on notice that maybe some kids are using your product, then you also need to comply with COPPA. That involves age gating. It also involves getting parental consent for collecting or before collecting a child's information online. But as Katie said, it's a little deep to get into right now, but Katie and I both did this at our previous startup. There's a lot of COPPA implications there. So let us know. You can email us at our addresses below if you have questions on that.
I think that's all of our time.
That's all our time? Okay, do we still have more questions? I mean, I can stay on as long as we need to.
Yeah, are we able to?
I think so, although I think the Denver Startup Week moderator jumped off, so we're kind of freewheeling it here.
We can just use this Zoom room forever?
I guess, yeah, I guess we live here now.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Awesome. I got a question from Ronna Kilmer about anonymizing data.
Ooh, okay.
Yeah. So if your data is truly anonymized and de-identified and you don't have the tools to go back and undo it, then you are subject to one of the exceptions of the CCPA, and you don't have to worry about it. But like you don't have to grant access or delete it. But you do need to make sure, like the huge caveat here is it really has to be anonymized, and you really can't go back out and go back into it and unanonymize or identify it.
Encryption too. Like if it's breached, but it was encrypted.
Also, if it's encrypted, like for the purposes of a breach, if it's encrypted and the bad guys can't get it and they don't have a key to unencrypt it, that alleviates many of your obligations under breach reporting, both to an individual and to an attorney general. And Barath, I mentioned in a response that resources for Legal 101, I've seen a lot of small business associations provide good resources. The Denver Downtown Partnership, I believe, does kind of legal-based evening seminars. I've also seen that if you're in the area, small business associations in Boulder and Fort Collins have those as well. I see oftentimes the Commons on Champa in Denver does Legal 101s. Lawyers will go in and do brief meetings with startup founders and owners and kind of do troubleshooting and question answering.
You want to read the next question or read the question?
Oh yeah, Barath asked for if there are any resources for like Legal 101 or starting up from a legal standpoint.
Questions?
I think that's it.
Are
Are there any other questions?
Speak now, forever. Peace. All right. Nothing coming in? Cool. All right, everybody, thank you so much for coming to our little session here. I know we touched on a lot. There's a lot we could expand on each of our points. So feel free to email us. You can find us on our respective websites. We'd love to help. We love data privacy stuff. We love helping startups. This is our bread and butter. And it was a pleasure getting to present to everybody today. So with that, I think we're going to sign off. Everybody have a great rest of your day, and we will